Okay, welcome back. Hope everybody had a good weekend and staying safe. So we're gonna let me just wrap up, or let me just revisit what we did last time. And so we did chapters 1 and chapter 2 during our first meeting last Monday. All right, and then the homework assignments for those two chapters are due today, and so I sent you an email reminder. And again, those homework assignments, you just post them in the discussion forum here.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
For studying the class, like, do you recommend us like reading the chapters in the book or guiding ourselves with the PowerPoint?
I'd recommend, like, we'll do the lecture, and so we'll go through the study guide and do the homework assignments and so on, and then I'd say after you learn the material, I mean, you can do it one of two ways. You can either read, if you have the book and you want to read the chapter, you could read the chapter before the lecture if you have time to do that, or I think you can after the lecture you can read the chapter to kind of refresh. But I wouldn't. I'll go through the main concepts in the PowerPoint, and so I wouldn't really recommend just going through the PowerPoint because some of those things we're not going to cover. I'll cover the highlighted things, but I would recommend if you have the textbook to go ahead and read it beforehand or afterwards because it'll kind of give some more feedback on that. But I mean, I think if you do go through the study guides during class or rewatch the video and can do the homework assignments, you should be fine. But make sure you understand all the practice problems and concepts, and then if you have more time, you can read the chapter and so on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay. All right. So here's where you post. Just a reminder. Here's where you post chapter 1 homework and chapter 2 homework, and all the other homeworks once we get to those. You have these are due today, so you have till the end of today if you want to do those. And so it seemed like maybe half the class or little more is posted. Is everyone okay with turning in the first two homework assignments? Are there any questions on the chapter 1 or chapter 2 homework? Okay. Well, if you have any questions on those, let me know. Because normally I'll maybe tomorrow or sometime early this week, I'll go through and grade your assignments, and then I'll post my solutions. And so once you pretty much you have until you can submit the assignments until I post the solutions. But yeah, so let me know if you have any questions. It looks like a little more than half the class has already turned it in, so you guys know what to do for those. Okay, so today we're going to spend the class talking about supply and demand and a bunch of stuff that goes along with this. So I'm sure you've heard about the concept of supply and demand. We're going to deep dive into that today, and that'll be chapter 3, which is today's material. Okay, and then I double checked, and we do not meet next Monday because it's President's Day, and so I'll have to move the topics around. But as of now, I think we'll do chapter 3 today, and then your homework assignment will still be due next Monday, but we will not have meeting because it's President's Day. So let me just post that to the chat. And so I kind of missed over that holiday when I was doing the syllabus. but that's okay. We can move some things around. But okay, so we do not meet next Monday, February 15th, due to the observed President's Day holiday, which is comes on one of our meeting days. But your Chapter 3 homework is still due next Monday, February 15th. All right, so if you really want to observe that day and not do any schoolwork, then you can turn it. I mean, you have a whole week to do it, and so it's not officially due until Monday. But you don't. I'm not making you work on President's Day, and so if you want to do it beforehand, tomorrow or earlier this week, and turn it in before, just make sure you get it in by next Monday. But technically you don't have to do any work, and we're not meeting on President's Day because it's an observed holiday. Okay? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and start talking about supply and demand, which is today's topic from Chapter 3 in your textbook. All right. So you can open up the Chapter 3 under Study Guides. Scroll down and you see the Chapter 3 with notes and solutions. You can open up that. Okay, and actually also I'd recommend, even if you don't have the textbook, I have a lot of videos that I attached in the study guides that we're not going to watch during the meetings, but normally I would show those like at the beginning of class or when I had free time. And so there's a bunch of links to the videos that I'll mention or refer to in the study guide. If you have time, they're only like 10 minutes each or less. And so another way to kind of refresh the material, either before or after the meeting, is to watch the videos, because I think they do a really good job of explaining some of the key points. And so there's a couple here on supply and demand in the study guide. So yeah, if you have time, uh, a good use of 15 or 20 minutes would be just to kind of go through those videos, because I think it kind of helps explain the concepts. Yeah. Okay, and then you can open up the PowerPoint for Chapter 3. Okay, so we're going to go through the study guide and some of the PowerPoint, and then we'll get to some practice problems. There's quite a few, and then I have a homework assignment for supply and demand for Chapter 3. We'll get to that a little bit later. All right, so let's, if there's no questions on the previous material, and everyone's good, it seems, on getting the first two homework assignments in, let's go ahead and jump into supply and demand, one of the most popular topics in microeconomics. Okay, so Chapter 3, demand, supply, and then equilibrium. We'll start with demand. We'll spend a bunch of time on that. We'll talk about supply. Then we'll look at market equilibrium and some changes in kind of government set prices and things like that. Very first thing is let's introduce the demand curve and talk about that on slides 3 to 8. Okay, so demand is a scheduler curve that kind of shows, or it does show, the relationship between uh, the price of some good or service and the quantity demanded by the market. And so it's going to show essentially the amount consumers are willing to pay or able to purchase at any given price. And it's holding everything else equal. The only thing we're looking at in a demand curve is price of that good and the quantity demanded of that good. Everything else is being held constant in the two-dimensional space. So we'll look at individual demand, just how one person or individual forms a demand relationship for a good or service. And then market demand is a summation of all the individual consumers that in an aggregate that makes up the whole market demand. So you kind of sum up all the individual demand curves that will do that. All right, so the law of demand is pretty simple. It states that other things equal. There's essentially a negative or inverse relationship between price and quantity. So other things equal, as the price of some good falls, the quantity demanded rises, and vice versa. When the price goes up, normally you see demand falls. All right, and this should be for most goods or services. This is pretty common, or you normally see a negative relationship because basically, if the price reflects the price you have to pay for that good or service, then if that price goes up, what happens is some consumers leave the market because now it's too expensive, or consumers that stay in the market cut back because that, given the same level of income and nothing else changing, that good or service got more expensive, and so the market's going to buy less of it. And also, when the price falls, more people or households enter the market, or the consumers that stay in the market buy more of it because now it's more affordable given nothing else changes. Okay, so you usually see a nice little inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. All right, so this simple graph of the demand curve should be somewhat familiar. If not, we're going to do a bunch of examples, but on the y-axis, we have price of the good. In this case, this example, it's a latte. And then on the x-axis, we have quantity demanded. And in this case, it's lattes per month. So what you see is when the price of this good latte goes down, then demand goes up because more people enter the market or consumers just buy more lattes, and vice versa. So you get this nice little negative relationship between the price of lattes and the demand for lattes. Okay, price goes up, demand goes down, price goes down, demand goes up. Okay, just note that the demand curve is kind of a simplification of reality, and so you're not really going to see this perfectly shaped curve. What you are going to see is a bunch of like observations, like if price is this, this is demand. If price is this, this is demand. And what you kind of get is a nice little representation of what that actual data looks like. And so we're not saying that the demand curve looks exactly like this in real life. We are saying that on average, we are saying that on average, when price goes down, you do see more consumers buy it or enter the market. And we do see that when price goes up, that consumers leave the market or consumers buy less of that good or service. Okay, so it's not a perfectly shaping demand curve we see like this in the real world, but the relationship and the concept and the law of demand holds very well with real data. Okay, so this is a nice, simple example of how the concept of market demand works. And market demand is just the sum of all all the quantity demanded at some price. And in this case, if we simplify it to three consumers, we have Joe Java, Sarah Coffee, and Mike Cappuccino. Okay, if you assume that that's the whole market, obviously it's not, but the concept applies. Okay, then each individual's demand is here. Okay, so we're saying this seems like a lot of lattes per week, but anyway. So if it's $5 per latte, then Joe buys 10 a week. If it's $5 a latte, Sarah buys 12 a week, and if it's $5 a latte, Mike buys 8 a week. All right, so again, this seems like a lot of coffee per person, and I would think that Mike Cappuccino would probably choose a cappuccino, but anyway, the concept still applies. So the point is that this is each individual person's demand, and the total market demand is just a summation of all of them. So if there's three consumers, this is that demand, that demand, and that demand, then the total market demand is just this plus this plus this. And so at $5, the whole market buys 30. Okay, and then you see here that when the price goes down, each individual person buys more of it, and then the summation of those three individual demanders is still the market demand. So the concept of market demand is at the price, just sum up all the individual consumers demanding, and that is your market demand. So it's always the sum of these three people for this case. All right, and so yeah, this is, I mean, at a price of $1, all of these. I mean, I drink a lot of coffee, but it seems like all these consumers are going to have like a heart attack. But 87 lattes. Okay. All right, so that's market demand. Okay, so here you go. Here's Joe's individual demand curve. Here's Sarah's individual demand curve. Here's Mike's individual demand curve. And at $3, the total market demand is just 35 plus 39 plus 26, which comes out nicely to exactly 100. Okay, so you see this like kind of horizontal summation of all the demand curves. And so at $3, this plus this plus this is the market demand. Yeah, I agree. That's a lot of lattes. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you were saying that like in the real world it looks a little bit different. So for like say for the lattes, would that some like the supply and demand curve would it cap out at a certain like number because obviously like that's a lot of lattes. That's not like a realistic number. So at some point does it like stop going up?
Yes. So I think see what you're saying. So if we look at this demand curve, right? You're saying is there some price at which I think you're. I mean, I'm not sure. I think we're going this way. So you're asking if there's probably some price at which no one, like everyone, leaves the market because it's too expensive. Like if the price of lattes went up to $100, is that the question?
I was thinking more like the quantities demanded.
Well,
Like
so
does that ever
you mean when
decrease and like get to the point where like it's not you don't see it going up any further?
Oh, okay. I see what you're so. Well, there's two ways. So there's two ways to look at that. So some goods, like so. Okay, so here's quantity demanded. So it's either going up this way or down this way. So if I look at this extreme, most likely the curve is going to get more Like when it gets more towards the side, it gets more extreme. So it's probably going to start, yeah, curving up like this. And so yes, the relationship will change, but there's probably also some price that no one's going to pay that ridiculous amount. So yes, the curve is going to start getting less or getting more steep here, but it's also going to hit the side at some point. Say this is like $100, and let's just assume. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just going to assume that no one's going to buy $100 latte, and so the demand curve at $100 would be zero. Now the same thing would happen probably this way, where even if the price goes super low to like 10 cents, you're going to see demand go up, but it's going to start leveling out or getting flatter because I mean, even if it's like 1 cent, if you're giving them away for free, there's only so many lattes people can take. And so, like for example, if you're if you're at a coffee shop and you've already had 3 lattes, and they say, okay, now lattes are free for the next hour. So you might have another 2 or 3, but after you've had 10 lattes, even if they're 1 cent or free, you're not going to buy any more because you can't consume that much. So yeah, there's going to be extremes where the shape of the curve gets steeper here and flatter here, but there's also some price, I think, for most goods at which demand is zero because it's just no one's going to pay that price. Okay. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right. So where were we here? Yeah. Yeah. So I think maybe these curves are a little misleading because I do think uh, even though see I think this one looks the most realistic because it's see how it's kind of getting close to the sides. It looks like Joe's is gonna Joe. It looks like if the price goes up to $50, that Joe's still gonna buy some, which he might, but that seems a little unrealistic. So I think this one, which kind of gets close to the side and starts getting steeper and kind of gets close to the bottom and gets flatter, is more realistic. But there's probably some price at which Mike's like, I don't care if I like cappuccino. I'm not paying for this latte. Okay. Um, okay. So here we're showing. So here's our original demand curve, and we're going to look at ways in which this happens. But I want to illustrate what an increase in the demand curve or a rightward shift looks like, and a decrease in the demand curve looks like this. And what I'm saying is that at this original price, in this case $3, if there's an increase in demand, it shifts out to the right because now, for whatever reason, consumers are going to buy more lattes at each price, and here a decrease at the same original price, the market's buying less. All right, so an increase in demand is a rightward shift like this from D1 to D2, and a decrease in demand is a leftward shift from D1 to D3, just illustrating that at the original price, here increase, the market's buying more of them, here decrease, the market's buying less of them. Okay, so we've introduced the demand curve, and the next thing we're going to do is talk about different ways or different things that can cause the demand curve to shift. And so these are called demand shifters, or one way to call them is demand shifters. I'm going to focus on a couple types, and, and we'll talk about those. And these are on slides 9 to 11. Okay, so determinants of demand. Another way of saying that is demand shifters, or these are things. So determinants of demand are things that affect demand that are not other than price. So, Okay, so determinants of demand are variables that affect demand other than the price of that good or service. Okay, so anything that's going to affect demand, cause it to go up or down, that is not the price of that good, is a determinant and a demand shifter. All right, and so we'll look at some examples, and there's probably many more that probably in your textbook or you can think of. And so anything technically that has a impact on demand is a determinant, but things that don't affect it don't have to worry about those. All right, so you could have some change in consumer tastes and preferences. That's going to affect demand. There's just more buyers. That's going to increase demand. The first example I want to look at is changes in income. And you kind of break this down into two types, which we're going to describe. Okay, so let's talk about now about a certain group of demand shifters or determinants. And this is income. And so let's break this down and define what a normal good and an inferior good are here. Okay, so a normal good, we're looking now at the relationship between income and quantity demanded, right? So we're only looking at two things: how demand changes when income changes. Now that change is going to depend on what type of good we have. So a normal good is a good in which kind of income and demand go the same direction. So when you get more income, the consumers buy more of that good or service, which makes sense. So let me write that here. All right, so normal good, quantity demanded, and income have a positive relationship, and that just means that when the consumers get more income, they spend more of it, and they increase demand. So that makes sense. If you're consuming something and you get more income, a lot of times you're going to buy more of it because, given everything else equal, the additional income allows you to spend more on that good or service. So that's a normal good. I'd say most goods we can define as normal goods, right? But there's also a type of good called inferior good, which has the opposite relationship. Okay, so an inferior good is such that quantity demanded and income have a negative relationship. And what I mean by that is when income goes up, okay, so when income goes up, demand decreases, or the other way, when income decreases, demand increases. So this sounds a little counterintuitive, but let's see if we can brainstorm some examples to make sense of this. So okay, so can we think of any examples of inferior goods? There's a whole bunch of them, and you might have seen some in the textbook. But any ideas of what type of good or service might exist, such that when the consumers get more income, they buy less of it, and when their income goes down, they buy more of it. So what kind of goods or services might fit in that category? Okay, so you can type something in there, or you turn on your sound. But can we think of some examples?
I have one.
Yeah. What do you got?
Um, like when your income decreases, you would buy like an off-brand cereal brand.
Yeah.
Um, but when your income increases, you would buy like the name brand cereal.
Yeah, that's exactly, you got the concept right, right? So if you're right, so you prefer to have the name brand one because it's better and probably a little more expensive. But right, if your income goes down, you might start buying store brand or kind of knockoff or generic brands, I guess. Right, and yeah, somebody wrote uh, inexpensive food like instant noodle. Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for. So the one classic example, right? Yeah, both of those are 100% correct. Instant noodles like cup of noodle or top ramen. Uh, Frozen dinners, assuming they're not pricey. Yeah, so things that, because you can probably see the idea here is that since we're talking all about food, if you had more income, you'd probably prefer to go out to a nicer restaurant or get more expensive takeout. But if you're on a budget or you lose income or you get unemployed or something, um, you can still survive on cheaper goods. And so that's the idea here. That like yeah, so any of those examples are perfect examples of inferior goods. Uh, Instant noodles, frozen dinners, um, generic brand cereals, commuter car or sports car. Yeah, that would work. Is assuming that assuming that that's just. I mean, that one good is. I think that works, but you got to make some. I guess some caveats. Yeah, but that works. Sure. Yeah. So if you're in this if you're in the car market and you need a car and your income goes down, you might switch or purchase a commuter car or a cheaper car. And right, if your income goes up and you can afford it, you might get a nicer car, a luxury car, or a sports car. Yeah, so all those are, yeah, we get the idea. Right. Okay. So, right. So if we were looking at inferior goods, okay, so the concept here is that if we have inferior goods and income goes down, then your demand would increase for that good, like any of those examples. And if income goes up, you'd buy less of it. So the when I say like demand increases when income goes down, that means the demand curve goes to the right, increase. Or when demand goes down, that means it goes to the left. All right. So the next little group I like to talk about is uh, the price of related goods. And so there's two groups, and we'll call them substitute goods and complementary goods. All right, so we got changes in the price of related goods. In this case, let's define complements. Let's do substitutes first, and then we'll do complements. Okay, so let's see if this makes sense. So substitutes, good X and good Y are substitute goods if consumers will switch between goods if the price of one of the goods gets more expensive. So what I mean there is if we have two goods and the price of one of them goes up, then consumers switch some or all of their consumption to the cheaper good because these goods are substitutes and one of them got more expensive. All right, so we need to think of an example or examples of like groups of two goods that might be substitutes. So what are, let me hear. All right, so can we think of some examples of substitute goods that might fit that category? So we need two goods, good X and good Y, and the idea here is we're looking at the price, and so
Could an example be gasoline?
well, what so the you need two things. So let me first. So here we got oranges. Well, I don't know the concept of using apples and oranges is the major example of like differences. So I don't instead of spray. Yeah. Okay. So okay. Yeah. Those ones sound good. So the oranges and apples one, uh, that would only work if the two goods were kind of the same kind of thing, right? And so if oranges and apples are different, then that might complicate the example because normally when you say like, oh, you're comparing apples and oranges, that means those two things are completely different. So maybe not there, but yeah, Sprite and 7 Up, okay, that works because it's pretty much the same thing. They're both lemon lime sodas, and so right, if one that works. Um, McDonald's and Burger King, yeah, that works. Yeah, those are pretty similar, right? If McDonald's gets more expensive, you might switch to Burger King. Um, tea and coffee might be kind of different. Like I think a lot of people only drink coffee and a lot of people only drink tea. So unless we're talking about just sources of caffeine, those might be a little bit different to consumers. Oh, when you're purchasing fruit. So I think so the apples and oranges, you mean like if you're going to the um, produce aisle and you see that like apples are cheaper, you buy those instead? Yeah, that okay, yeah, let's just say fruit sources. Okay, sure. Yeah, so if you're just looking for fruit or some kind of, fruit source and you don't care what it is, you just want the cheapest one, then sure, that works. Okay, if we phrase it like that. You just gotta make sure that we phrase it correctly. Okay, so
So for like coffee and tea, it would be like the specific brands of coffee, correct?
yeah, I think that would be, yeah. So if we're looking at like Pete's Coffee versus Coffee Bean, that might work. Or if you're looking at like um, Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf versus Earl Grey or something like that, the tea. Yeah, so if you look at specific brands of tea, those might be substitutes or specific brands of coffee. But I think crossing tea consumers and coffee consumers might complicate things because some people only drink coffee, some people only drink tea. And so, but yeah, but it'll works if if you phrase it like that. Um, Metro fees, yeah, sure. It's cell phone services. If you just want the cheaper one, yeah, that works. Oreos and store brand cookies. Only okay, so only if the store brand cookie is like a knockoff Oreo. So if it's like those where the Trader Joe's, like the JoJo's, I think those are, yeah, that would work. Uh, Colgate versus Crest, yeah, that's the same. Yeah, we get the idea. So we get, I think, right. Yeah, it's uh, anyway. So personally, I think that JoJo's might be a little bit better, but Okay, so we get it, right. So the point here is that we're looking at the prices of, we're looking at the demand of one good compared to the price of the other good. All right, so let's use that as an example, that last one. So what I'd say, how would you analyze this is, okay, and also thank you for not, no, no one said Coke and Pepsi, which is the one I've heard a billion times. So I thank you guys for being creative and not saying Coke and Pepsi. Okay, so if we have good X is Oreos and good Y is JoJo's, and those are substitute goods, right? The idea here is that okay, so if good X is Oreos and good Y is JoJo's, and we define them as substitute goods, then the idea here is if the price of JoJo's increases, that good is now more expensive, and so consumers switch and demand increases for the now cheaper good, which is Oreos. So if the price of the substitute increases, the demand for the other substitute increases. Okay, so the price of JoJo's increases, then the quantity demand of Oreos would increase because now that good is relatively cheaper. Okay, now let's define and talk about complementary goods, complements. Okay, so complements are two goods, X and Y, that the consumer must consume together. Okay, so can we think of this type of example? So we need two goods in which the consumer or consumers needs both those goods together. And so there we go, yeah, tennis balls and tennis, right, those goods go together, right? Tennis balls and tennis rackets, those are complements. Oh yeah, that was the example in the homework, pancake and whiskey. But yeah, probably pancakes and syrup is a better example. Okay, so yeah, pillows and pillowcases, yeah, that works. Gotta have those together. Okay, so right, what we're trying to say here is what happens to the demand for one of them when the price of the other goes up. So if we use the tennis balls and tennis rackets, and yep, toothbrush and toothpaste, that works. Yeah, cars and gasoline, you definitely need those. Corn tortilla to taco, that would be substitutes, right? Because those are, you don't need, unless we're talking like double decker tacos from Taco Bell, but Okay, so if we use that first example, let's define tennis balls and tennis rackets as complements. And so what would happen? So if the price of tennis balls increases, then the demand for tennis rackets. So what would happen to the demand for tennis rackets if the price of tennis balls increased? Would it go up or down?
It would decrease.
It would go down.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, all right. We all got it. Yeah, so it would go down because this bundle, this consumption bundle of tennis balls and tennis rackets you got to have together, that bundle got more expensive because the increase in price of tennis balls, and therefore you have to compensate and buy less tennis rackets because yeah, that bundle got more expensive. So right, the opposite relationship exists with between substitutes, comparative versus complements. Right. Okay. So I think we got those concepts. Okay, normal goods and inferior goods. Yep, and then substitute goods versus complementary goods. All right. Okay, so I think it's time to talk about supply on slides 12 to 15. So supply curve time. This yes. Oh, so we already know this, but yeah. Well, skip that. Here's supply. Okay, so a supply curve is the same. We have the same axes. We have price and we have quantity on the x-axis, and we're looking at what happens to total supply of the good or service when the price goes up or down. And we'll look at individual and then market as a summation of all the individuals. But here we get a positive relationship between price and supply, kind of like this. Okay, so we get this law of supply, which is the opposite direction. And so the idea here is that when when the price of the good or service goes up, then supply increases because that's giving that firm or business more revenue. And so almost always when you get a price increase, price in the market goes up, you'll see more supply because it's now a higher revenue good or service. Okay, so price acts as an incentive to producers to produce more, and a lot of times there's like a cutoff point in which firms below that point don't supply, and then when it gets to a certain point, high enough, they can start producing because it covers their costs. So you pretty much always see a positive relationship because when the price of a good or service goes up, then the total supply for that service also goes up. All right, so here we go back on the lattes. Um, so we're saying here that when the price of a latte goes up, it's better for the coffee company or for the business. And so as the price goes up, the supply of that good or service also goes up. All right, so when the price of lattes is only $1, there's only a few supplying, a few firms. When the price of that good goes up, more suppliers, and so on. So you get this positive relationship between the price of the good and how much is supplied of that good. In this case, a latte. Okay, so this represents a change in supply. So this middle one is the original. Increase in the supply curve is going from S1 to S2, like that, to the right, and a decrease is going from S1 to S3. So just make sure you see that a decrease in supply is going up or left, and an increase in supply is going down or right. And so that's because at the original price, this represents the fact that suppliers supply more, and this represents the fact that suppliers supply less. So increase in supply, decrease in supply. Okay, so now let's talk about some supply shifters or some determinants of supply. And these are things, just like we saw on the demand curve, that will cause the supply curve to shift. If something affects supply other than the price, that curve is going to shift to the right or to the left. Okay, so a bunch of things. So I'll kind of there's a couple categories I like to use. So the resource prices, technology, and taxes and subsidies. Those are the main ones I like to talk about. So let's focus on those. Okay, so there's all kinds of things that can affect supply. Number of sellers, obviously, if there's more sellers, that increases supply. If some other goods change, that might affect how you supply. Like if we're talking about, what were some examples up here? Colgate and Crest, if like, anyway, and then producer expectations. So there's all kinds of things that affect supply. But I like to focus on these main groups that I highlighted. So we'll talk about resource prices, technology, and then another important one is taxes and subsidies. But just know that there's a whole number of things. These other 3 bullet points and a whole bunch of other things you could probably find in your textbook. So anything that affects supply would cause it to shift. But let's just pick some examples that are important ones and understand those. Okay, so a change in a resource price. Okay, so this is like an intermediate good or a resource that goes into the final good and service. So this is like if we're talking about cars, there's a whole bunch of individual things that go into the final good or service. So like the rubber for the tires, the computer equipment for the smart console, the glass, the metal, all the safety features, the airbags, so all those things that go into the final good before it's sold are resource prices. So if those prices go up, it gets more expensive for the firm to supply that good, in this case a car. And so an increase in the resource price would decrease supply because it got more costly for the firms to supply it. Okay, so resource price goes up, supply goes down or decreases this way. Okay, another nice one is technology. So if there's some kind of boost in technology, meaning that with the same inputs and factors of production, you can now supply more because it got more efficient. There's some boost in technology, some computer breakthrough, or some analytics. That's good because you can now supply more given the same resources. So that's going to cause an increase in supply because now it's cheaper because at the same input you get more output. So technology or some technological improvement is going to increase supply. Okay, and you can probably guess that a tax is bad for suppliers. If there's a tax on supply, then that's going to make it more costly because it just increases the cost of getting out that final good or service. So a lot of things have a supply tax, like cigarettes, things like that. And so if you're a supplier of cigarettes and there's a tax or an increase in tax on each unit sold, that's going to make it more costly. So taxes or increase in taxes decrease supply. All right, and then a subsidy is basically like a payment or like a negative tax, and so you get a bonus or a monetary payment if you supply this good or service. And so a lot of goods like I don't know, solar energy, you get subsidies for those if you supply them, or like green initiative things or things that have environmental benefits often get subsidies. And so if you get a payment for supplying it, that's increasing or making it cheaper to supply it. So if you get a subsidy or increase in the subsidy, that is going to increase supply. Okay, so the next thing to do is to bring together demand and supply. And so that's going to be called market equilibrium. All right, so everybody, we doing okay? Any questions on demand or supply so far? All right, market equilibrium, slide 19. Let's take the demand curve, let's take the supply curve, put them together, and see what we get. Okay. All right, so here we go. We took the market demand curve for lattes, the green line, and we put the market supply curve for lattes, the red line, and these are different amounts of supply the market would supply at the price of lattes, which goes up when the price goes up, and these are different amounts the market would buy or willingness to pay when the price of lattes changes and it goes down, demand goes up. And so you can see there's one price or a range, most likely, but here at a price of 3, that's exactly the point when the amount of supply and the amount of demand is equal. So at a price of $3, this is supply and this is demand, and they're both at 7. Okay? So the idea here is that there's some price or some area of prices in which you reach an equilibrium, and kind of this is the sweet spot of going a higher price would mean there's a surplus. Okay, so there's suppliers who want to supply but not enough buyers, and at a lower price there's a shortage, and there's consumers who want to buy at that price, but it's not profitable enough for suppliers to get there. So there's some price or region in which equilibrium exists, and this case is $3 and 7,000 lattes. Okay, so what if we have equilibrium, and then what if something changes? So if the demand curve shifts out of equilibrium, right, for any of those reasons that we talked about, like substitutes, complements, inferior goods, income, or if supply curve changes due to input prices or technology, something like that, what is the resulting change on equilibrium? Okay, so let's start with equilibrium and then do some changes and see what happens to the market price and market quantity. Slides 21, 23. Okay. All right, so if we're in equilibrium, D1 and S, and there's an increase in demand, the result is that the new equilibrium, so this is saying that an increase in demands means that the market is willing to buy a higher amount at the same price. All right, and so what that's going to do is an increase in demand is going to go shift us up here, and there'll be the result will be a higher market price and a higher market quantity because there's more consumers willing to pay a higher price, and suppliers are willing to go up the supply curve and start supplying this additional amount. Okay, so if demand goes up, what you have is a higher market price and a resulting higher market equilibrium or higher market quantity. If demand goes down from D3 to D4, so D4, yeah. So now we're saying that consumers aren't willing to buy as much at the same prices, and so what's going to happen is some consumers are going to leave the market, and or actually, yeah, some consumers will leave the market, and some suppliers will leave the market because they can't supply at this lower price. But we go down here, and the result of a decrease in demand is a lower market price and a lower market quantity. Okay, so increase in demand, we go from here to here, and decrease in demand, we go from here to here. Okay, what about if supply shifts? Okay, so here we start at S1 and D. An increase in supply is a rightward shift from S1 to S2, maybe due to a subsidy or something like that. So we get a subsidy, we increase supply, or the market does. And the result here is those suppliers are willing to supply at lower prices due to the subsidy or whatever. And so we get a lower market price down the demand curve and a higher market quantity. Okay, so we go from here to here, and the resulting new equilibrium, market price is lower, market quantity is higher. Okay, and finally, if there's a decrease in supply, maybe we got a tax, and tax causes the total supply to go down. Okay, so we start here, supply decreases, and what you see is that the result is a lower market quantity, so some consumers and producers left the market, and only suppliers that can supply at higher prices stay in, and consumers who are willing to pay this higher price stay in. So decrease in supply, we go from here to here. The result is an increase in the market price and a decrease in the market quantity. So this is the shift here. Okay, there are going to be some cases we're going to look at when both curves shift. And so it looks a little messy at first, but it's important to understand what happens when both curves shift or what you can figure out. And so we'll look at some of these scenarios in a little bit in the practice questions. Yeah, so you know exactly what happens if just demand goes up or down, or just supply goes up or down, but there's a range of effects if both curves shift, which is likely because a lot of times demand changes and then supply responds. Like if usually this goes first, so like if consumers say we're willing to, so just take the example of like I don't know, streaming services. So right now there's clearly, or at least recently, there's been an increase in demand for streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max. There's getting more and more, and so what's happened is in response to that increase in demand for streaming services, there's also been an increase in supply, and we'll look at a case in which both things change. And also sometimes supply responds when demand goes down. Uh, Obviously, consumers right now are buying less services, especially like vacation trips. So, or let's look at like airlines. So, um, at least in the last year, the demand for airline travel has gone down, and so there's been a lot less flights supplied in response to that. Okay, so those are more complex cases in which demand changes and supply responds in reaction to demand, which we have to look at. These are just cases in which so this is just, it was Super Bowl Sunday, people bought more beer, all right? There's probably no change in supply, just maybe, so just a short-term thing or something like that. But if there's response from supply to demand, then we got to look at a more complex case in a little bit. All right, so okay, the last few slides are on government set prices, and we're going to look at a price ceiling first. Okay, so this is the analysis, the supply and demand analysis of a price ceiling. So a price ceiling is a government imposed price in which, it's only going to have an effect if it's set below the price, all right? And it's going to lead to a rationing problem. An example of, well, we'll go through the graph, but this is often seen in black markets, and a big example is rent control. So the price ceiling looks like this, where let's say that this is the supply of the good or service, and this is the demand. And if there was no ceiling, this would be the price, 350 and Q0. But in this case, there's a ceiling imposed saying that you can't legally buy or sell above this price, and the ceiling is set below what would have occurred in the equilibrium. And so this is often seen in like a rent control situation, and we see this a lot in like big cities like or dense cities like Brooklyn or San Francisco, where if there's a rent control situation, it's possible that people or residents are willing to pay a higher price, but they cannot because there's a restriction or a lower price put on rent, and therefore you're not legally allowed to charge higher than that rent control price unless there's a change of occupancy. And what that does is because there's not a lot of space to expand in big cities, it leads to a shortage because you can't get enough housing. And one of the reasons, just aside from the fact that there's not enough housing, could be the ceiling is restricting people from relocating which leads to a shortage. So what we're saying is that at this $3 price, this is the supply and this is the demand. And so there's people that want to buy it at that price, but there's not enough suppliers. And so in the rent control situation, we're saying there's not enough rental units or rental properties that can rent at that low price, and you're left with a shortage where some people want to get a rental place, some suppliers want to supply it, but they can't do it at that price, and so there's a shortage. Okay, and this also works. This can also be applied to like a black market situation because if you're looking at something that's sold in the black market, most likely it's going to be a price. Actually, oh, that's a response to, yeah. So you might see like a black market situation in which this is the government set price for rent or whatever, and someone's just goes to the renter and says, "I'll just give you cash for the rest to pay more for the unit." So I guess there's illegal ways to get around it, but this is the concept of a price ceiling. So see how the ceiling is here, and you can't go above the ceiling, and it leads to that shortage. Oh, so let me question. So the questions are: what are your thoughts on rent control, given that it creates a price ceiling? Well, it, it it definitely leads to a short. I mean, there's definitely a scarcity of housing in most rent control areas, And so it doesn't, I guess there's other ways to look at it. If your goal is just to keep people in the residence, or to like prevent lots of change of residence, that it might work at that, because it gives people an incentive to stay in one place and not move around. And so if that's your goal, then maybe it works. But if you're trying to control for the shortage of housing, then it doesn't really work, because it just increases, it just makes it more difficult for like smaller rental units and like single family residents to rent their units, and you get more big corporations that can rent at those lower prices, but it pushes out people who might rent. Uh, and yeah, I think it definitely leads to a shortage of housing, because it doesn't allow all these. See, there's this little gap of people who would supply, would rent, but they cannot do so.
Yeah, this
Cool. And the reason why I was asking, because um, like some people say that like it shouldn't exist, like rent control shouldn't exist, like 'cause there's two sides to it, like one being the renter and the other being like the person that actually like owns the property. The reason why I say is because like rent like is like, well, like in my area it's like it's constantly increasing in price. So like also they say like it's like with this the idea of like the cycle. Um like wages, I have, from what I see, like wages haven't kept up to like the price of like the rent. So it's like, how do you afford housing when wages at your job haven't kept up with it?
Yeah, I see. So that's a good question. But so the well, the idea here is that the the rent control situation is, yeah. So it like, if you're renting in a rent control area, then that's obviously good for you or whoever's renting it, because the price is cut below the market. And so, like, if I had a rent control situation, I would definitely want to keep it, because it's a better price. And so, yeah, obviously, if you have rent control and you eliminated the people that had those rent control properties or rental agreements, are going to be worse off, because now they got to pay a higher price. So for the people that already have the rent control area, it's definitely a benefit to them to keep it. But it doesn't. It does lead to there is a shortage of housing, especially in California, and I think what it also does is it pushes up the price of housing, just for like purchase units, and so the price of housing is so high even during like a pandemic for housing in California, that it's it's not really, it almost seems like the price of housing it has no uh, correlation with wages, because you're right, wages are not rising with the price of housing. But a lot of the reason we have a huge um, a lot of reason why the price of housing is so high is because there's not enough of it, right? If there's more housing, more people could buy it, and so on. But there really is not, or just in terms in economic terms, there's not enough housing in California, and because of that, the price of housing is skyrocketed even during a pandemic. Well, so yeah, so I mean, this little model is just a simple representation, but this tells you that rent control. The point of this graph is, this says that if this is the representation of rent control, it leads to a shortage. Okay, so if you don't want a shortage, then that's an argument against rent control. But again, if you're someone who has a rental unit under rent control, and if it gets taken away, you can't afford your housing, then obviously that's not good for you. So, in terms of leading to a shortage, it seems like rent control is a bad idea. But if you have the rental unit under rent control as a renter, and that gets removed, and you have to pay a higher price, then that's not good for you either. So there's different ways to look at it, but just in terms of it leading to a shortage, this is what this is what the model says. Yeah, and so I think this was on, I don't know if you've all voted in California, but this was on the ballot a few months ago for a rent control situation. But yeah, it's always kind of a hot topic, and especially when there's right. No, so I mean, the value of the house is determined basically by the market. So the pricing index does whatever the consumers say. A rent control situation is imposed by the government, and so no, it completely. There's no. I mean, there's some correlation, but a rent control is actually imposed by the government, whereas the value of housing is determined by just the willingness to pay of the buyers. Okay. All right. So last thing here. Did I answer your question, Thomas?
Um, kind of. Well, so for example, let's say I live in a house and it's $3,000 and I choose to rent out the house, and if rent control kicks in, does does it correspond to where like it's not going to undercut me in order for the future renter, so I don't lose my house? Does that understand? I don't know if I'm saying it right. Um,
So
yeah, like it's not gonna undercut me by, oh well, the new renter has to pay 2,800, but so it's good for the renter, but it's not good for me because it cost me 3,000 to keep my house in check.
right. So if you're the owner of the house,
Yeah.
rent control is definitely not good for your I guess profit margin, because normally the way rent control works is this is the price is agreed upon, and then you you as the owner could not raise the rent unless you get a new occupancy. So basically, like if it's under rent control, as soon as you get a new tenant, you can raise it to the market price and it gets locked there. But then you can't raise it again until that person or household moves out. So yeah, it's as an owner of the housing unit that you're renting out, it's not going to help you because you can't um, adjust your price with the market. You got to keep it that way unless the person moves out of the household. Right? Yeah. So right. So in no way would this be good for the supplier of the housing because you're limiting your rental revenue. But like I said, if you're I've heard stories of people that have um, or households that have like rent control apartments in Brooklyn that have been in the family for like 200 years. So there's people paying like the market value of a rental unit in like the 1900s that just because they keep it in the family. And so, I mean, that's probably an extreme situation, but yeah. All right. So let's talk about the other type of government set price, which is a price floor. Okay, so this is the opposite, and it's going to lead to a surplus. And so a price floor is a price set above the market price, and it leads to surpluses. And the example we'll talk about, which it applies here, is minimum wage, because we just talked about wages and housing. Okay, so here we go. Word. So let's use the example of minimum wage law. All right, classic example of a price floor. And so this is the supply of labor, which is like the employers, the workers, and this is the demand for labor, which are the firms and the businesses. All right, and if there were no minimum wage, uh, what this says is that there's a lower price that some workers would be willing to work and some suppliers would be willing to supply at that price. And because of the minimum wage, in this case here, the floor, you can't charge below this price or can't put the wage below this price. The result, or what this would say, is that at that higher situation, these firms don't get to give out jobs, and these workers don't get to work because they're willing to work at a little bit lower wages, but they're not legally allowed to. And so the idea here is that this surplus is unemployed workers. Okay, so that's kind of the idea, is that if you think this is accurate, this means that there might be employees willing to work at lower wages, and they cannot because of the minimum wage law. Okay, and so I know that the response here is, or I mean, the point of minimum wage is for people to have a working wage, right? And so obviously as a worker, you want to have the highest wage possible. And so that's the argument for this. But there's also workarounds, like uh, if the minimum, like it's likely that if the minimum wage goes up, that the type of work that employees offer will change, which is kind of what's happened. And so if the hourly wage goes up, you're probably going to see more like contract working and like gig working, as they call it, in ways around that, because that's kind of what you see, is that if if it becomes unaffordable for firms to pay their laborers, then they kind of get to work around it. But again, if you're an hourly worker and the wage goes up and you have your job, it's good for you, but it's probably not good for the the. I mean, I saw that um, there was like the hero pay for grocery store workers that was passed in some counties, and obviously that's great for the grocery store workers, the employees. They get paid hourly to get the extra $5, I want to say it was. But I also heard that there were some grocery stores that had to like close down because they couldn't pay their workers that much. So there's two ways to look at this situation. What is the question? Do you think minimum wage should be? Um, I don't know. I don't know. I probably, yeah. I think the minimum wage should be higher in California versus other states. That, yeah, I definitely think that, if we're going to argue. But there's, like I said, there's also ways. I know, right? $15 an hour in yeah, yeah. So I think it should be adjusted. Having a just a, well, what's going to happen is if that passes and there's $15 an hour in every wage paying job, then two things will happen. One, people who like the places that have a low cost of living, like I don't know, South Dakota or something, people are going to start relocating there. Or, like I said, the employers are going to start operating like Uber and make their employees contractors and not and work around the wage law. So if there's a nationwide increase of the minimum wage to 15, my guess is you'll see a change in the type of work. There'll be less employees and more gig contract workers, and also you'll see a shift of workers to the now high-paying wage in cheaper areas of living, and so I don't think it'll have the desired effect, right? Okay. All right. So, yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Yeah. So these are always interesting topics, I think. So, any more questions or comments on the um, price ceiling, the price floor, minimum wage, or rent control? All right, so we're done with the PowerPoint, okay? All right, so there's a couple videos here on supply and demand you can check out when you get a chance to, if you want to look at those. All right. All right, let's look at some examples. So just some short answers. So the first one is what will happen? What will each of the following? What effect will each of the following have on the demand for small autos, such as the Mini Cooper and the smart car? So there's a statement, and we're going to say what happens to demand after that statement happens. So if small automobiles become more fashionable, all right, that's an increase in demand because now more people want to buy that good or service. If the price of large autos rises, but the price of small autos remain the same, you're going to now get an increase in demand for the cheaper good, the substitute good, which is now small cars. So demand increases. If income declines and small autos are an inferior good, right? Remember just the way we defined inferior good? Inferior good means if income goes down, demand goes up. So if you coined or categorized small autos as inferior goods and income went down, not saying that would happen, but if they were inferior goods, by definition, a income decline would lead to an increase in demand. D, consumers anticipate that the price of small autos will greatly come down in the near future. And so what this means is that if consumers are willing to wait a little bit for the cheaper car, they're going to buy less now, so demand decreases now, and they'll hopefully wait for that cheaper price in the future and buy the cheaper auto when the price goes down. Okay. E, the price of gasoline substantially drops. Now, the reason why this is ambiguous or we don't know is because we don't know how this is going to affect the behavior of small cars versus like trucks and more SUV less efficient cars, because if gasoline gets cheaper, that makes all cars cheaper. So it could be that people double down, gas gets cheaper and they buy more smaller cars which are more efficient, or that could mean that now the cost of like trucks and SUVs is also cheaper, and there might be an increase in demand for that. So we don't know. This is more of a behavioral question. We don't know just based on what happens to gas. All right, let's go through some supply ones. What effect will each of the following have on the supply of auto tires? A technological advance in the methods of producing tires. Remember, technology boost leads to increase in supply. A decline in the number of firms in the industry. All right, there's less suppliers, supply decreases. An increase in the price of rubber used in the production of tires. Remember that's an example of a resource price or input price. If the resource price that goes into the final good or service gets more expensive, that's going to make supply more expensive, so supply decreases. D, the expectation that the equilibrium price of auto tires will be lower in the future than currently. So because when the market price goes up, that's better for suppliers, that increases their revenue. They're going to try to supply more now at the higher price, and they'll want to supply less at the lower price because the higher price is better for suppliers. Okay, a decline in the price of the large tires used for semi-trucks and earth hauling rigs with no change in the price of auto tires. So this is saying there's two different types. If the selling price of bigger those other bigger tires goes down, then this good becomes more profitable for firms, so they're going to increase supply because this good is now relatively more revenue bearing, I guess. Okay, F, the levying of a per unit tax on each auto tire sold. That's bad for suppliers. That increases their costs. They're going to decrease supply. In G, the granting of a 50-cent per unit subsidy for each auto tire produced. Okay, they're getting paid to supply, so they're going to increase supply because the subsidy makes it more profitable. Okay, so yeah, those are some nice little cause and effect. If this happens, what happens to supply, and if this happens, what happens to demand? Yeah. Okay. Number 3. So how will each of the following changes in demand or supply affect equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in a competitive market? That is, do price and quantity rise, fall, or remain unchanged? Or are the answers indeterminate because they depend on the magnitudes of the shifts? Okay. So I put a little chart here. So the first few, so we start with equilibrium, and then one of the curve shifts. We already know what happens based on those the graphs we looked at. So if we're in equilibrium and supply decreases and demand is constant, remember we saw the supply curve went to the left, and the market price went up, and the market quantity went down. All right, we already looked at that graph. We already looked at this one. When demand goes down and supply is constant, price goes down and market quantity goes up. When supply goes down, when supply goes up, increases, and demand is constant, that led to the market price going down and the market quantity going up. And then this other one, E, when demand increases, supply is constant, that increased the market quantity and increased the market price. Okay, but we haven't looked at yet what happens if both curves shift. All right, so I put a little chart here from the textbook, I think, that shows the matrix of if supply goes up and demand goes up, what's the outcome? So these are all the cases in which if both go up, if both go down, or if one goes up and one goes down, what's the final effect? So we'll kind of go through these real quick and see if this makes sense. So the first case, when both curves shift, oops. Okay, so let's say that demand increases and then supply also increases. So remember this was like the streaming service examples. The demand for streaming services went up, and I'm pretty sure there's been a big increase in supply of streaming services. So this responded to that. And so given just the fact that the demand curve goes up and the supply curve goes up, can you determine what happens to the market price and market quantity? Kind of. Okay, so if there's more more people buying and more people selling, then you have to know that the market quantity is going up, right? But you don't know the final effect on price because it is determined by which of these shifts is bigger in magnitude. So if there's more buyers, or if there's a bigger increase in demand versus supply, then the price is going to go up because the consumers are willing to pay higher prices. Whereas if the supply curve increase is bigger in magnitude, the new price will be lower because they're willing to supply at lower prices. So the point is that both of these things, these changes or shifts, put pressure on the price in opposite directions, and whichever one is bigger in magnitude is going to have the final result on price, but we don't know what it is. Okay, so price would go up if the demand curve shift was bigger. All right, and so that's the point here is to determine which thing you know for sure, and which thing depends on the magnitudes of the shifts. In this case, it's the price. Okay, so do we see the kind of the logic there? What I'm trying to say when both curves shift, you can figure out which of the variables changes for sure, whereas the other one is not known because it depends on which of the curves has a bigger magnitude. All right, so do we see how this result is coming out of this statement here? Okay, well let's do a few more, and there the charts here to give you the answer, but I do want you to understand what the kind of the logic is. So another situation is, let's say supply goes up and demand responds by going down. So I don't know. Let's say that I don't know. The supply of airlines went up, and then in March the demand went down. So that's a situation here. So if supply goes up and demand goes down, you you can see that if this goes up and this goes down, you don't know what's going to be the bigger one, and you don't know what's going to happen to quantity because supply is going up and demand is going down. Uh, whichever one is bigger, if supply is bigger, the new market quantity will be higher. If demand is bigger, the new market quantity will be lower. But you know the price goes down because if supply goes up, uh, they're willing to supply at lower prices. If demand goes down, that means they need to pay lower prices. So this pushes the price down. This pushes the price down. If both those things push the price down, the new market price will be lower. Now, this final effect on quantity depends on which of these curves is bigger in terms of the magnitude of the shift. Okay, another one here, G. So we're going through all the cases. So there's 4 cases of just one curve shifting. Demand goes up or down, or supply goes up or down. And there's 4 cases in which there's a combination of both curves changing. So all the 4 cases are listed here. Ambiguous means the question mark. All right, so we did this one. Demand increases, supply increases. We determined the price was ambiguous or indeterminate, and quantity increases. We did this one. Supply increases and demand decreases. So we determined that the price was going to go down and the quantity was undeterminate or ambiguous. There's a couple more. Okay, demand increases and supply decreases. So if, all right, so the answer or the chart is up here, but just think about um, you're not going to know what happens to the new market price because there's more consumers but less suppliers, but we don't know if there's going to be more additional consumers or less drop off of suppliers. So we don't know the effect on quantity, but we know the new price will be higher if demand goes up and supply goes down because demand goes up, consumers are saying we'll pay more. Demand goes down, or supply goes down, that means the suppliers need a higher price to sell at to make it profitable. So this pushes the price up. This pushes the price up. Well, the price is going to be higher. But we don't know which of these curves is the bigger one. And so therefore, the final effect on the new market quantity isn't known until we know the magnitudes. So this goes up and this goes down, here you go, prices increases, and the quantity is ambiguous or indeterminate or a question mark. Okay, last one is demand decreases and supply decreases. That's the final case. All right, so when both the curves go the same direction, then the new market quantity has to be lower. So there's less buyers, there's less sellers, there has to be a lower market quantity. Okay, consumers left, suppliers left, the resulting outcome will be lower output, lower quantity. But we know that this means that consumers need lower prices, and this means that suppliers need higher prices to supply, and we don't know which of these outcomes is bigger in magnitude. So again, if this is bigger, then the price goes up. If this is bigger, sorry, if this is bigger, the price goes down. If this is bigger, the price goes up. We don't know which is bigger. We just know that the directions of the shifts. So the effect on a decrease in demand decreasing and supply decreasing, here it is. The quantity goes down, obviously, but the effect on the price is question mark, undeterminate, or ambiguous. Right? So this little chart explains kind of the, well, it tells the answer, but hopefully you understand the logic of what's going on here. Okay, so that was a lot of shifting in analyses, but so do we get the idea of how we're trying to determine the effect, the new market price and new market quantity if one or more things changes? So questions on what we're trying to accomplish here with the kind of the comparative statics when curves shift, and what's the effect there? Okay, well, let me know if you have questions on these concepts. There's, yeah. Okay. Number 4. So now, so we've looked at all the cases, but sometimes you get a little more information. So make sure this makes sense, that when you're told specific information about how the magnitudes of the shifts, then you can determine the outcome when supply and demand both shift. So here, suppose supply and demand for olives, suppose the demand for olives and the supply of olives decline by equal amounts over some period of time. So state the effect on equilibrium price and quantity. All right, so we looked at that case. When both demand and supply decrease, okay, which is here. So this decreases and this decreases. So if we didn't have any more information, well, we know market quantity is going down. If both the curves are shifting down, the new market outcome will be less quantity. But we didn't know the effect on price. However, we know that, right, because we were trying to see which of these curves was bigger in magnitude, but it tells us right here, they both decline by equal amounts. So that means that the distance of the magnitudes is the same, and the effect on price is going to be canceled out because the demand, the negative shift in demand is putting downward pressure on the price, and the negative shift of supply is putting upward pressure on the price. But because they're equal amounts, that's the same magnitude, and we're going to get, they kind of cancel out and result at the same price. And the only change is that the quantity goes down. Okay, so price is constant because the curves have the same equal amount, same magnitude, but because demand and supply both go down, the new market quantity will go down. Okay, so do we see that there? Why they cancel each other out? Because only because they're the same exact. They shift by the same exact amount. All right. Next one, number 5. Okay, we got a few more. So number 5, let's assume that both the supply of bottled water and the demand for bottled water rise during the summer, but supply increases more rapidly than demand. So now we have another statement that we got a little more information. So we know again, now we know which curve has a bigger shift in magnitude. So both supply and demand rise. Okay, so increase in supply, increase in demand. The new market quantity is going to be higher. That's got to go up. But we didn't know initially the effect on price because it depends on which curve had the bigger magnitude. But this question tells us which curve has the bigger magnitude. It tells us that supply increases more rapidly than demand. So that means that the supply curve shift is bigger in magnitude, and that's going to win out in the price factor. Okay, so both curves shift increase, quantity is going up, but the supply curve shift is bigger. So there's a bigger increase in supply than there is a bigger increase in demand. Okay, and if there's more suppliers, that means they're willing to supply at lower prices, and this is the bigger magnitude shift, and therefore the outcome will be the bigger shift result, which is supply was bigger than demand, and supply beats out the pricing effect, and the final effect is obviously the market quantity goes up because they both went up, but the price goes down only because the supply curve shift was bigger than the demand curve shift. Okay, so is this making sense? Have I lost you guys? Okay, well, great. All right, so there's a lot of outcomes on pricing and quantity, but the point is take the information you get on which of the curves change and see if you can figure out the outcome, because we're always trying to figure out what's going to happen to the price and the quantity, and you can figure it out if you look at the information that you got in the little statement. Okay, a few more examples. And so here, this one's kind of nice. So let's use the table below to answer the following questions. So we have quantity demanded in thousands and quantity supplied in thousands at this good or service at different prices. All right, so at $25, this is supply 60,000, and this is demand 80,000. When the price goes up, uh, demand goes down, and supply is 60,000. So at different prices, this is the supply, and this is the demand. Okay. Now, A, if this table reflects the supply of and demand for tickets to a particular World Cup soccer game, what is the stadium capacity? Okay, so you can see the way this chart is structured, that the quantity supplied, in this case for World Cup soccer games, is 60,000 always. So it's no matter what, it's 60,000. Okay, and that's because we're looking at like a arena stadium um, situation or like venue, and the seating capacity is 60,000, and that's always going to be the case because you have 60,000 seats, regardless of what demand is. So you see how it's always 60,000, and kind of the supply is fixed for a situation for like um, a baseball stadium, a concert, things like that, and here it is, always 60. Okay, B, if the preset ticket price is $45, would we expect to see a secondary market for tickets? And if so, would the price of a ticket in the secondary market be higher than, the same as, or lower than the price in the primary original market? So go to the $45 situation. Okay, the stadium capacity is 60. The price set on the tickets is 45, and you can see that the demand for the tickets at that price is 70,000. So there's more people that want to buy at that price than can be supplied. And so what's going to happen, and this kind of explains nicely what would happen or what used to happen, not given the current situation, but if you bought tickets on like StubHub or Ticketmaster or whatever, any of those sites, Vivid Seats, and so what's happening is they're buying the tickets and trying to adjust them based on the market price. So if the tickets are set at $45 by the stadium, but people will pay more than that, then you're going to get a secondary market in which these tickets are purchased and sold at a higher price because at 45, demand exceeds supply, and they'll probably increase the price until it gets to 65 because that's the case when supply equals demand. So at 65, you get just enough people who want to buy tickets that fills the stadium. Anything below that, more people want to buy it. Okay, but it can also go the opposite direction. Like if the price was 45 and suddenly demand dropped, like um, it was a big game, but you had some players get injured or something happened, and the demand for that game went down. You might see that the ticket and the price in the secondary market is lower because that reflects the fact that not as many people want to see it now, given the injuries or whatever happened beforehand. Okay, so at 45, we get a secondary market with higher prices because at 45, demand here exceeds supply. Part C, let's suppose that for some other World Cup game, the quantity of the tickets demanded is 20,000 lower at each ticket price than shown in the table. Okay, so if the ticket price remains at 45, would the event be a sellout? So you see that we're assuming that the demand is 20,000 lower at each price, so we're pretty much subtracting 20. So if the price was 45, then we're saying that this is 50. Okay, so you can see that if the price is 45, the stadium capacity is 60, but demand is only 50,000, then here's a case when not enough people want to buy the ticket at this price, so the event's not even going to sell out. There's not going to be a secondary market because there's going to be basically a surplus of seats because only 50,000 want to buy at 45, but the stadium capacity is 60,000. Okay, so we've analyzed both cases where demand is higher than the current price and demand is lower. Higher demand, you get a secondary market. Lower price, you're probably not going to get a sellout. Okay, yeah, so questions on this one? Everything, everyone doing good? This makes sense? Okay, one more example, and then we're done with the study guide for supply and demand. So now we got number 7 is you get to do a little algebra and solve for supply and demand. It's kind of fun. And I'll put a couple of these on your homework assignment because it's okay. So suppose demand and supply are given by these two linear equations. So this is quantity demanded, which has a negative relationship between price. Quantity demanded equals 50 minus P. All right, this is price, and QD is quantity demanded, and QS is quantity supplied, and that equation is 1/2 P minus 10. Okay, and what you want to do is, because they're linear, you can solve for the equilibrium price and quantities by setting them equal. So A, solve for the equilibrium price and quantity. So what you can do is say that at equilibrium, the quantity demanded has to equal quantity supplied. So set these two equal. Okay, at equilibrium, this has to equal this, right? So let's set them equal at equilibrium, and we'll solve for the price that makes that situation occur. So when does 50 minus P have to equal 1/2 P minus 10? Okay, let's find the price at which that happens. So we got this. All right, let's do a little bit of algebra, just kind of rearrange, right? So if you want to, what do we do? If you want to add P to both sides and add 10 to both sides, you get 1/2 P plus 1 P is 3/2 P, so like 1.5 P, and 50 plus 10 is 60. So if you do that, you get 3/2 P equals 60. Then if you just multiply both sides by 2/3, this one cancels out to 1, you get P equals 2/3 times 60, and that means P equals 2 times 60, which is 120 divided by 3, and it comes out nicely to a price of 40. Okay, so all we did there is set the two equal, do a little algebra, and find the only price in which those two can be equal. All right, then when you get the price, you want to check that quantity demanded and quantity supplied at that price are both the same. And if that's the case, then that's the market quantity. So let's put that 40 into the demand curve. Okay, 50 QD equals 50 minus 40 for P. All right, so 50 minus 40, we get a quantity demanded of 10 at a price of 40. So QD is 10 at 40. Let's put the price of 40 into the supply curve and confirm we get the same result. 1/2 P minus 10 is our supply curve. Let's put in P of 40. QS equals 1/2 40 minus 10. Half of 40 is 20. Minus 10, and we know that 20 minus 10 is 10. So we've confirmed that at a price of 40, quantity demanded is 10, quantity supplied is 10. So there it is. The market price, P star, that clears the market is 40, and the market quantity, or the market clearing quantity, is 10. Okay, so P star, or market price, is 40, Q star, market quantity, is 10. All right? Okay, yeah, do we see that, what we did there? Just set them equal and do a little algebra and find the price and quantity that clear the market. Okay, B. Last one, let's state the effect of an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. Now this one you could just look at the chart, but we know that when demand goes up and supply goes down, okay, we don't know which one is bigger, so because demand is going up and supply is going down, the final effect on quantity is indeterminate because, again, it depends which of the ships is bigger, but we know the price is going up, and that's because when demand goes up, they're saying we'll pay higher prices, and when supply decreases, they're saying we need higher prices to keep supplying, so this pushes upward pressure on the price, this pushes upward pressure on the price, the new price has to be higher. But because they go opposite directions, we don't know the final effect on Q star, and that's going to be indeterminate or ambiguous or question mark. Okay, so for ones like this, you can just kind of work through it, or you can go look at the chart that I put in the study guide here, and see, look at the situations. Here we had demand increases and supply decreases, so there's the effect we just talked about. So these are all the outcomes. All right, so there we go, a bunch of examples there and some practice problems. Questions on anything we just went through, or anything in the study guide on supply and demand? All right. Okay, last thing is just to show you guys the homework, and then we'll finish it up in a few pretty soon. So homework assignments. Chapter 3 homework. All right, so just a couple questions similar to what we just did for that last one. So here you'll have a couple linear supply and demand curves. All you gotta do is set them equal, find the market clearing price and quantity, all right? And then you'll get a little statement of demand does something and supply does something, and what happens to the new market price and new market quantity, and then you get another one. So a couple nice practice ones where you solve for the market clearing price and quantity, and just state the effect when two of the curves shift. Okay? Yeah, so you can use the one we just did as an example, or you can let me know if you have any questions on this. So yeah, everyone good on what to do for this one? Okay. All right, so just to let me wrap things up. Okay, so make sure that there's a few more students. All right, so the chapter 1 and chapter 2 homework are due by the end of today. So if most of you have already turned it in, but if you haven't, you have until the midnight tonight to turn those in. And the chapter 3 homework is due next Monday. And remember, next Monday is a holiday, it's President's Day. So I don't want to make you work on President's Day. So if you don't want to work on President's Day, just it shouldn't take too long to do that homework assignment. There's only a couple of questions, so just you can post it or finish it beforehand. But it's not officially due until next Monday. But next Monday there's no class because we can't have class. We have to observe the holiday on President's Day. All right. So I'll probably send another email reminder on Sunday just to make sure you don't come. But these two due today. this is due next week, but no class next week because President's Day. All right, so we're not gonna meet for 2 weeks, and when we do come back, we're gonna cover the next topic, which is chapter 4, elasticity. I'm gonna have to adjust the due dates because this will not be due. These are good so far. All right, these are due today. That's due next week, but this will not be due on February 22nd because we have a 2-week period. So we'll do chapter 4 in 2 weeks when we meet. But if you have the textbook and want to read ahead, the next thing we're doing is chapter 4, elasticity. Okay, so yeah, everyone good before we finish up for tonight? All right. Let me know if you have any questions on the homework. But again, I'll see you in 2 weeks. No class next Monday, President's Day. But yeah, everyone have a good rest of your week and next week, and a good President's Day weekend. But I won't see you for 2 weeks. So everyone stay safe, and thanks for coming. And I'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.